Foundations of Amateur Radio. There's a recurring question that never seems to get a straight answer. Why are we using 50 ohm impedance and not 75 ohm? The more people you ask, the more answers you get. There'll be commentary about standing waves, SWR, loss, incompatibility, soldering, cost, velocity factor, diameter, susceptibility to noise, and the list goes on and grows. The more people you ask, the longer the list. Of course, as time goes by, people remember stories told to them, guess, or even, make stuff up. To steal a phrase, why is it so? In the 1930s, when most of us were not even the apple in the eye of their parents, let alone their grandparents, coaxial cable was being developed for kilowatt radio transmitters. There are two aspects to consider: the amount of loss against the length and the ability of coax to handle power. Without going into the maths, there's plenty of that online, the lowest loss for air dielectric cable is 77 ohms. If we look at the peak power handling, that occurs at 30 ohms. That is, at 77 ohms, coax is best at getting signal across the cable with the lowest amount of loss, and at 30 ohms, coax is best at dealing with high power. Clearly, a compromise is needed. So, the mean between 77 ohm and 30 ohm is 53.5 ohm, and the geometric mean is 48 ohm. So, 50 ohm is a compromise between power handling and signal loss for air dielectric. So obviously 75 ohm is used for TV reception and not for transmission. Except it ain't so. In 1938, Roy Plunkett invented PTFE, or Teflon. This material wasn't around when 50 ohm was decided on. If you remember, coax consists of a few parts: the center and the shield, each conductors that we use to move our signal around, and something in between, the dielectric, which stops the two conductors touching, with a cover over the top of that for good measure to protect against shorting and damage. The dielectric can be an air gap, or some form of plastic, like PTFE. Electrically, the dielectric constant for air is 1. For foam PTFE, it's 1.43, and for solid PTFE, it's 2.2. Turns out that this makes quite the difference. Our lowest loss coax is 77 ohm for coax with an air dielectric, but drops to 64 ohms with foam and 52 ohm with solid PTFE. So, rather serendipitously, 50 ohm was a grand choice, good power handling capability and low loss with a solid PTFE core. Now, why are we using 75 ohm for TV? One suggestion is that it's another compromise between low loss and cable flexibility. But what does all this mean for you? In a nutshell, 75 ohm coax is one type of compromise. 50 ohm coax is another. You can use either, but they won't be the same and won't react the same. Calculations made for one will not apply to the other, and loss and power handling will be different. This means that your roll of cheap quad shield RG6 is perfectly fine for some aspects of our hobby and not for others. Here's an interesting tidbit to tide you over until next we meet. If we compare RG58, common in amateur radio, to RG6, common in TV, the losses are quite different. For 100 meters of coax at different frequencies, these start to add up. At 1 MHz, the difference in loss is 0.6 of a dB. At 10 MHz, it's 2.2 dB, and at 145 MHz, it's 10.7 dB. To be clear, the loss for RG6 is lower across the board. This really means that you shouldn't be afraid to experiment. There's nothing particularly special about the different types of coax, and each choice has its advantages and disadvantages. I'm Ono, Victor Kilo 6, Foxtrot Lima Alpha Bravo.